Look at that. Here we go. All right. Thank you for being in this. And I am going to kind of just tick my way through a bit of a subject matter and somewhat of a concept that everybody needs to get. And the concept is that your words do matter more than what you know, and that you are on the hook. I'm not going to talk to you like I'm trying to get you there. I'm going to talk to you like you're already there, okay? You're on the hook to become an educator. And so the idea that somebody else is going to teach somebody else is a concept that is the antithesis to what the Bible lays out. And so you have to understand that it is your responsibility to not only believe in education, believe in Hope Corps, and believe in a higher calling. It is your responsibility to both educate those who do not think they need that and to recruit. Now, this is not a salesmanship seminar, okay, for Hope Corps or for Wilson U or for anything else. This is a concept that is laid out in Scripture, that you're going to create whatever culture you're in by the way you communicate. Now, communication to many people is this right here. Answering every text and every phone call. This is not communication to me. Okay, this is a part of it. Very small part. And if I have my way, it's going to get smaller. Okay, communication is what you're doing with your life. Your words matter. You have to talk. In fact, God didn't even create the world without using words. He could have done pizzazzy things and amazing things. He could have sprinkled stardust on everything and it would have grown in psychedelic colors. But he opened his mouth and said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Communication is how you create the world you live in. And that's what I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes. Okay, Mark Twain says, this is an interesting thing. He says, when he's talking about an observation, this is a puzzle that he played with almost his entire life. And the basic idea is, how in the world can these Jews live past empires? He wrote about it. If you read a book about his speeches, it's like salt and peppered all through it. He was fascinated by this. Let me read this to you. He had a marvelous fight, talking about the Jew and the Hebrews. They had a marvelous fight in this world and in all ages, and has done it with his hands tied behind him. The Egyptian, the Babylonian, the Persian fill the planet with sound and splendor, then faded to dreamlike stuff and passed away. The Greek and the Romans followed, and they made a vast noise, and they are gone. Other peoples have sprung up and held their torch high for a time, but it burned out, and they sit in the twilight now, or have completely vanished. The Jews saw them all, beat them all, and is now what he has always been, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmities for their age, no weakening of his strength, no slowing of his energies, no dulling of his alerting, aggressive mind. How things are mortal but the Hebrew, or other forces pass but they remain. What is the secret of their historical immortality? He wrestled with this almost his whole entire life. Now, that is a great question. It's a fascinating question. What is the secret to the Hebrews' historical immortality? We know that they have favor from God and they have promises from God. Promises from God In my opinion, based on historical, empirical evidence, promises from God are more important than land, more important than armies, more important than crowns. Because when you're dealing with a speaking God, he creates a world when he opens his mouth. Now, if you are, and I am, in the image of God, when we open our mouths, we too create a world. What kind of world do we create? With our mouths and with our minds. If I was preaching, which I'm not today, the Bible says, I'd have all these scriptures right if I was preaching. Proverbs 18 and something says, the power of life and death is in the tongue. You create the world you want to live in by the words that you use. You are on the hook to be a communicator. It's not an option for you. It's not something that it's multiple choice. Challenge Week is not giving you A, B, C, D, or none of the above. You're on the hook to communicate. You have to speak. And if you're going to speak, what will you say? What words will you use? And what methods will you employ? Now, the secret to the Hebrew survival throughout the ages, under conditions that we often know as exile, dispersion, homelessness, powerlessness, persecution. Normally, nations survive because they have a myriad of assets and resources. However, the Jew for millennia have not had any of that. In fact, no other nation has kept its identity under such circumstances, and no other nation has kept its identity for as long under any circumstances. The Hebrews uniquely survive where empires fail. Now, the answer, in my opinion, is set out in the book of Deuteronomy, which in Hebrew means devarim, which is words. The name of Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy, is taken from Deuteronomy 1:1. These are the words of Moses. And they named the book Words. It's a very powerful naming of a book. What I find interesting is that the man who said in the beginning of his ministry, "Now, Lord, I'm not a man of words." One generation later, 40 years after wandering in the wilderness, he is now more wordy than any other man in Hebrew history. He is an endless fount of words. What changed him? What made him a man of, I am not a man of words, to a man that his last and final will and testament is named Words? It almost seems like an oxymoron, a confusing thing. Let's go to the next slide here. Let's talk a little bit about the command to use words. In Deuteronomy, there is a command to use these words. Deuteronomy 6, I'm going to get to the Shema here in a moment. But these words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your sons. Let me say this. This scripture right here is right after our beloved Shema, Yisrael. Hear, O Israel. These words, what words? The words that I'm speaking to you. Okay? I am commanding them to you to be on your heart, not to be in your sermon notes, not to be on the tip of your tongue. Get it in your heart. You get it in your heart, and you have a command to speak. You have a command to teach. And this is a fundamental concept issue that we have in modern Pentecost, is that there's some that are for education, some that are against it, some that are professorial, some that are teachers, some that are not. All of that is balderdash. You don't get to pick and choose. God spoke to you, pick your words and open your mouth. You have a command to be an instructor, or else you will not survive. Every culture that decided to operate in silence is gone. They operated in, they emitted transferred their messaging through myriads of things. empires, palaces, thrones, kings, it's all gone. But the one culture that said, because God speaks to me, I get and listen to what he says, it gets in my heart, and I'm commanded to now go out and repeat that in my own context, in my own words. That's the culture that survived. All of them. Evangelism is not an option. Testifying is not an option. Words matter, and you create the culture by the words that you use. In fact, Deuteronomy chapter 6, in our same beloved Shema text, he says that your sons will ask you in a time to come, saying, what do the testimonies and the statutes mean? And then you shall say to your son. So that's a command to use words. Teach them, Deuteronomy chapter 11, you shall teach them to your sons, talking of them when you sit in your house, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you rise up. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house, on your gates and on your days, and the days of your sons may be multiplied on the land which the Lord swore to your fathers to give them, as the heavens remain above the earth. They placed education at the very heart of faith. Their heroes were not warriors, they were teachers. They were rabbis. They were men who used words. And if we understand where we're at, we have an absolute mandate to do this. Okay? They created shields, which are houses of study. These are citadels of teaching for their children. In fact, in Hebrew law, anywhere where there's 15 families, they will pool their money together and hire one of those 15 that they will be a teacher, and they will send their kids to it. So schooling was that important to the Hebrews. In fact, let me tell you an interesting story. Okay, well, let me preface it by saying that what makes Judaism interesting is not just that there was famous people in it, but it was an idea that literacy, it was the first time that universal literacy could ever be conceived or imagined, okay? And so up until this point, I think, I don't know why it is this way, I'm clueless on this fact. I looked it up in the Chinese dictionary, the earliest one, or the latest one that I could find is like 1870s. I don't know why they don't have a more recent one, but there's 40,000 characters. For you to learn, me to learn 40,000 characters, that's about a 20-year endeavor. Okay? So up until you have this thing called a Bible, a Torah scroll, how did people communicate? Well, they did this through, and I'm not doing this on reading today, though I could run off on the same rant. This is like a podcast in live form. I can just stand here and do stream of consciousness, and it's fun. So that's what I do on Truth Talk. So I just talk about books. So you take this idea that 40,000 characters takes 20 years to learn this. Let's see, what else did you have? Hieroglyphics, thousands of characters. Ideograms, I think the smallest culture that had the smallest set of ideograms that they could write something out is 450 characters. Was better, but it was massively confusing, and the people who wrote it couldn't even read it. So then you have cuneiform, which has tons and tons of markings, and it's just baffling. So the Hebrew idea, Proto-Semitic, I don't know where it argues where it came from, but anyhow, they reduce it down to 22 letters or signs that we can learn. In fact, A, B in Hebrew is Aleph, Bet, and that's where you get the word alphabet. Okay, this is the first time ever that we've got 22 or 26 if you look at the early Proto-Semitic alphabets. But anyhow, you got 22 to 26. This is the first time that whoa, everybody should be able to read and write. And then God shows up and says, you're going to teach this law to every child when they get up and when they go to bed. You open your mouth and you teach. Well, that was shocking, okay? In fact, there's a little known, it's a bony fact, it's a little skinny fact, but it's earth-shattering, okay? If you read in the book of Judges, chapter 8, Gideon goes up to fight the Midianites. Remember that? So he goes up to fight the Midianites, and he goes to a town. I forget. I think it's Sukkot. He goes to the town, and he says, hey, my guys are hungry. Give me something to eat. And they said, no, we'll make a deal with you. You get out there and win against the Midianites, and then after you do your work, we'll give breakfast. Well, that made him mad. He didn't like that. So he leaves hungry. Never send a working man to work hungry. He gets out there and he puts a whooping, as they'd say, on these Midianites. This is a crazy thing. And people don't even think about this. They just read it in the Bible and don't even think about it. He comes up out of the valley, the vale it says, and there's a kid standing there. And Gideon says, I've won over the Midianites. I beat them. He said, I want you to write down the names of every one of the elders in that city over there. This little kid standing on the street, he writes down 77 names. Now think about how mind-blowing that is, that up until this point in culture and in history, nobody knew how to do this. Education was the elite. It was a hierarchical thing. I'm telling you right now, you got to learn 40,000 characters. Only very few of you is going to actually do that. There's going to be some really smart guys up at the top, and the rest of society is going to be down there going, huh? And that's the way Pentecost is acting right now. Like learning is an elitist thing. Brother, go back to this Shema thing. It is all of our responsibility. Gideon comes up out of this valley, looks at this little kid, and he says, write this down. That's mind-blowing fact right there. Because everywhere else, only these elite priesthoods were the smart guys. Everybody else was clueless, illiterate. But God had inculcated the command to use words and literacy ubiquitously into a culture for the first time in the world history that Gideon looks at a kid on the street and says, come here, you little scribe. That's mind-blowing, guys, because that never happened before. Ever, anywhere in the history of the world. And it shows up in this little kid writing down 77 names. And you know what historical and societal anthropologists do? They look at that verse and they are blown away that, my God, your kids knew more than what most cultures in that period of time knew. Why? Because of this right here. Okay, let's go to the next thing work on. Okay, what changed Moses? What changed Moses from saying, I'm a man of not many words, to by the time he dies, he is a man of the most words. Okay, what changed? Because he had a generation he had to transfer revelation to. If you are able to live inside your own head and heart, no need to be a man of words. Just live and die with what you have. But if you wake up with an urgency that the next generation or somebody else better know what I know, you don't have an option but use words. You become a teacher. You're an educator. Okay? Now, the main difference is if any change in human experience take longer than one generation, education and it becomes the primary and fundamental concern. Why? Because you're not going to do that by sitting in your own head space. You're not going to do that by walking around, and there's people that can do it, but you're not going to do it by saying, I'm smart and they're ignorant. You're not going to do it by sitting in the door and not going in yourself and not allowing anybody else in behind you. If you ever get kissed with the burden that I've got to pass this to another generation, all of a sudden you become a man or a woman of words. You start talking, right? But why? Because we are the offspring, one man said, of a speaking God. Therefore we speak because our Father speaks. And so the culture we create is with the words we use. Now, if we use hateful words, we create a hateful world. If we use godly words, we create a godly world, okay? So Judaism was not born at a place where they were building buildings, they were building a language. And so it's a fascinating thing. So let's go to the next thing. We've got to breeze through some of this. Okay, so what does other cultures build? Well, obviously in the Mesopotamian culture, they can build ziggurats. And that's the building that's up there on the top right. Egyptian pyramids. And then you have the Greeks build the Parthenon. And so what are they all doing? They're all building with buildings the ability to tell people we are great. Okay, all of that says, when you walk up to any of those, you're just like, wow, what a people, what a culture, however, they're all ruins. The Hebrews made a distinct difference in that they chose not to build buildings, they chose to build children. And when they started working on passing it to the next generation, they implanted within their own culture a historical immortality. Okay? And go to the next slide for me. So you have the Roman Colosseum, the Greek Parthenon, the Mesopotamian ziggurats, you have the Egyptian pyramids, which notice, they're all kind of built, especially the pyramids, they're a distinct messaging system, that there's one guy up there and he's the main between God and man, and then all the rest of you are down here on a hierarchical order. The Jews alone decided to pass out books. And when they did that, they secured themselves beyond building, time, and space. They chose to use the Proto-Semitic language and they chose to teach that to their children, so much so that Gideon can just look at a kid on the street and say, you do what only very few in any culture anywhere on planet Earth can do. Write me down names. And the kid's completely literate and starts writing names down. Why? Why did they do this? What is the impetus behind this? Because God gave them words. In fact, the Deuteronomy, the covenant, and this is a fascinating thing to me, because what America's built on, what most other nations are built on, is a concept of what we possess. The Hebrew nation, in their covenantal contract in the Sinai wilderness, is a covenant of what we give away. What do you give away? We give away this revealed truth to the next generation. When our kids get up, we tell them, and when they go down at night, we tell them. And so they're working on this in a very systematic way. Okay? Let's go to the next slide. I want to just talk real brief about, so early in his linguistic study of the Nazi language, an author, Klemperer, he zeroed in on the most insidious and effective element of Nazi vocabulary. He wrote that it was not the speeches, not the articles, the pamphlets, not the Nuremberg rallies, not Hitler standing there like a crazed nut, screaming and spitting, that made and had the Nazis their greatest effect. It was rather in the individual words, the idioms, the sentence structure, repeated millions of times over, that soared up and were absorbed mechanically and unconsciously within a culture. Thus, this, quote, civilized language, of which Friedrich Schiller wrote, became deadly poison when it was composed of toxic elements. Words in the Nazis' manipulation of German mindset became the tiny dosages of arsenic that were swallowed unnoticed and that initially appeared to have no effect, but after a while the poisonous action was fully present. It was fascinating to me in his book. He gives a list when he said this was one of the most influential things over the mind and the reservations of the German culture that they ever did. And he gives this out Joseph, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Goebbels, whatever. He gave out a list of words, not sentences, not mantras, not words that every radio station had to say every so often. Why? Because if he could drive these poisonous double meanings into the people's subconsciousness, then he would create a world in which hating a Jew and killing a Jew was normative. What did he use to do that? Well, he used words. What did Hitler use? Speeches. Before he ever used tanks, he used speeches. Before he ever used a gun, he used a microphone. Why? Because the very people that he hated and sought to exterminate was the very people that had proven that they had a historical immortality because of the value of words. So he stole their weapon first. Forbade them to print, forbade them to teach, forbade them to write, forbade them to preach in the synagogues. Excuse me. Burned their synagogues, did all this. Why? Because words are the ultimate weapons. And so when we get in our highest form of self-congratulation, we stomp around and we hoot and holler on Sunday night because we are the one God people. Shema Yisrael. Eloheinu Adonai Eloheinu Echad. We are the one God people. And then we wake up on Monday and we are not the one God people. Why? Because if you don't wake up on Monday and teach your children what you shouted about the night before, you're not monotheistic. Because the franchise to monotheism is that every one of you are on the hook to become an educator. So stop fighting it. Stop resisting it. Stop allowing people in your world to create this faux image that educators are the elite at the top of the pyramid. That is Egyptian, and we are not an Egyptian Christian religion. We are a Judeo-Christian religion. And when they say that, you say that's a pyramid way of thinking, and pick up your Bible and say, I am an educator. Because when I get up on Monday morning, the only way I can build the bridge between what I shouted about on Sunday night is not in my notes, and it's not in my shout, and it's not in my sermon. It's in my daily words with my children. Because if I choose not to transfer it to the next generation, I cease to become that in my generation. So that's what changed Moses from saying, I'm not a man of words, to by the time you get to the book of Deuteronomy, which is Devarim, which is Deuteronomy 1:1, it's literally, the title of the book is The Words of Moses. He was pretty wordy at the end. What made him wordy is he recognized that what I have to translate to a further generation. And if I do that, then I have no choice but to make education a fundamental and primary concern. Okay, let's talk about something else. Let's go to the next one. All right, to the world, words are worthless and talk is cheap, but in the church, they're priceless. Okay? They are the very thing that keeps us alive. They're the very thing that makes it. In fact, when I say, let me give you an example. When I say, I promise, I said it. I don't just say that I said it. I actually make a world I have to do something with, okay? So when words are the paramount concern, it is a window into the culture of people. This is why I'm a little scared by people who say we don't need education, because what they're doing is messing with my oneness monotheism. Because when I got called to be oneness, I got called to be an educator. And for me to say or allow someone in my world to say education isn't important and an educator isn't what I am is like someone standing in my church saying I'm not oneness. Okay? So think about this. Words matter. The best way to discover what is unique about a civilization is to find out in their lexicon what's in their words or not. So think about this. The Inuit people, the Eskimos, they have over 60 words for snow, but don't have any word for sand. Why? Because sand isn't in their head. It's not. They don't know what it is. It's not on their ground. It's not. There's no representation of it anywhere. So why have a word for what doesn't exist? So words matter. So think about this. The Greek word for, I'm not going to attempt it in Greek. I think it's like megalosykos, which is like psychos, but it's where the closest we could get to it is megalomania. Okay. And what that means is Aristotle unpacks this as the great soul, a man that is larger than life. If you were reading other writers, they write of the great man complex, right? Aristotle plays this out, and then certainly others do as well. In fact, Winston Churchill, when his wife Clementine rebuked him for how snottish he was acting towards one of the butlers or servants, and he had been very, very misbehaved at dinner towards him. He was probably a little soused, a little sideways drunk, and he turned around and yelled, "Yes, he is a butler, but I am a great man." And so in his mind, he was the great man, and everybody else was just on the lower end of the thing. And she told him later on, she said, "That great man understands your language. He can read and write as well, and words matter to him." So there is a leveler about literacy, a leveling effect of it. Okay, so we don't, in Judeo-Christianity, we don't have a word for megalosykos. Why? Because we value humility, not this grandeur that just plows over everybody, okay? So then you take the Bedouin people who live in the desert. They have over 200 words that mean sand or are some type of an idiom for sand. They have words that tell you if the sand is blowing in the air. They have words that tell you if the sand is in your toes. They have words that tell you if the sand is wet or dry, how abrasive it is. Why? Because that's representative of their culture. On the flip side, they have no word for snow. I don't know what it is. So I want to ask you a question. 613 laws in the Old Testament. And the Hebrew language, this is an astonishing fact, okay? They do not have a word that means obey. The Hebrew language has no word that says obey. Now, we've translated it into the English, but it doesn't exist, okay? In fact, when Israel formed up the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, they had no word for obey. Well, you got to obey commands, right? You got to do this. You're in a military industrial complex. So they borrowed a word from the Aramaic that does not exist in the biblical, does not exist in any of that context. And what they've done is they use it, but the word doesn't exist in the Hebrew Bible. So how does the Hebrew from God understand we have to obey this stuff? Well, they use the word Shema. Hear. It means to take heed, to contemplate, to concentrate, to focus, to put it in your heart. Let it get inside of you. Don't just blind obedience and run along. Let it get down in your heart. So there's no word for obey. In fact, you can see a derivative of this word, I think. I don't know the chapter and verse, but you remember the story where Abraham and Sarai come up with this idea that he'll go have another child by Hagar, and then Hagar's mistreated. She goes and runs away, and an angel shows up. Remember that? And the angel shows up and says to her, "I want you to go back, and whatever she says, you Shema." He uses the same terminology as Deuteronomy 6 and 4. Shema, you hear it. Why? Because words are important in the Hebrew language. And words are more important than anything else in their world. And so we're living in a culture where, okay, think about this for a second. I'm almost done. Think about this. William Tyndale's translating the Bible, right? And he's going through all of this, and he's passionate, and this is right. They're getting ready to kill him. And so William Tyndale gets to this part of the Hebrew word hesed. And it means, the best you can translate it is loving kindness, going outside of oneself to the degree that you become the other person, right? And it's it's very hard. It can't be altruism. It can't be just I gave them something, because literally you are giving so much of yourself, you cease to be yourself and you take on their identity or plight, okay? So William Tyndale's like, there's no way this concept is an identity losing gift. How do you translate that? And so he starts searching through the Bible, trying to find a way in which he can articulate this. Well, there isn't a way. So he says, okay, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to find where is the most perfect example of this concept that isn't Jesus Christ, because people will be able to say, well, that's loving kindness, but that's God toward us. So that's not like us. That's him being this. I've got to show that the concept of loving kindness in this broad of a dimension is horizontal, not just vertical. So he says, okay, so who besides Jesus has demonstrated this in the Bible? Well, the best example we have is Ruth. Ruth comes to Naomi and says, I love you and I'm not leaving you. And then she says, she gives herself so completely that she ceases to exist when she says, and your God shall be my God and your people my people. So I'm willing to give up my identity for the love that I have for you, and I'm willing to become you. Well, he says, oh man, okay. So this is the only way we have to explain this. So he introduces in high middle ages English a word that is called ruthful. When's the last time you walked up to someone and said, thank you, you've been very ruthful? Never? No, I don't either. The word's gone in our culture now. But the negation of it's left, ruthless. That's where that word came from. There's another part. So what are you? You're the people that are restoring ruthfulness, while the rest of the world is living in ruthlessness. Words matter, folks. But somewhere in the high Middle Ages and advanced modernity, especially in post-modernity, we've become so ruthless that we don't even think about being ruthful. Why? Because the world we've created by the words we use is a very stiff, cruel, and hateful world. Why am I talking about this? Because heaven depends on you to educate a world raised in ruthlessness, that Ruth still exists in the world today. And that while the rest of the world has eliminated this, you uniquely are educators. And you stand, while they build pyramids, you pass the book on to the next generation. And while the rest of the world says, I couldn't live like that, you uniquely have the ability to witness and educate and go beyond yourself to restore the lost words and create a culture that is both loving, that is both altruistic, that is faithful. Why? Because, as William Tyndale said, there's no way I can translate this, so I will just call it ruthful, meaning chesed. But the world don't understand it, and especially now, we're only left with ruthless. And then God walks in and says, okay, let's have a challenge week. And let's knock the foolishness off the agenda that you're not an educator and that education isn't important. Let's go back to our monotheism. Let's become supremely oneness. And that means that whatever I shouted about on Sunday night, I get up on Monday and I use my words to transfer it to another generation. I talk about it to my children. See, monotheism is not just the numerical valuation of the Godhead. Monotheism is the reality I live in with God. Monotheism in the whole covenant of Shema, I have to talk, I have to teach, I have to transfer it. I'm calling you today to consider that you're not here to be quiet. Maybe when you was a sinner, Maybe when you got in church, maybe when you first started and you first did this, you wandered up to Jesus and you bumbled around at an altar and you said, Lord, I'm not a man of words. But by the time you have the responsibility to transfer it to another generation, they'll name your whole life wordy. Why? Because that's your job, is to speak and to transfer the revelation God put in your heart to the next generation. Okay, I'm all finished. I'm not gonna go on and on and on about it. But I just want to tell you that you are all educators. And don't you ever allow anybody, after the Lord has given you the covenant and after the Lord has given you the book, don't ever let anybody come back in and build pyramids in your life. Because pyramids will only be relics of the past. But what we have will be the very seed of historical immortality. And that's what God's calling you to. It's huge, it's heavy. It's a burden, and that's the point of it, is that you go out of here and say, I have to teach what God has taught me. You've been through Hope Corps, you've been through Wilson University, maybe you have, maybe you haven't, but whatever it is that God uses to build into that, you have an obligation to go outside of yourself and to put it in your own words, okay? I'm not here to just repeat Brother Wilson over and over and over and say, quote, Dr. Wilson said, or this person said, or that person said. It just comes out of me. It comes out when I'm preaching. It comes out when I'm teaching. Why? Because it's my job to put it in my own words and give it to my children. Somebody said, so that's plagiarism. Really? I call it monotheism. Now, if I write a book and I earn money on it, it's plagiarism. But the only way you can honor your teachers is to gossip about what you've been taught until everyone in your world understands and knows that. That's the only way to respect that and honor that. And so Jesus says, this is where he says, greater works will you guys do. Because you're going to take what I have, you're going to put it in your own words, you're going to tell everybody. So when you read the book of Deuteronomy, there's hardly anything new in it. It says all the same stuff that Exodus says. It says certainly all the same stuff that Leviticus says. It says all the same stuff that Numbers, it repeats Numbers almost verbatim at times. But if you notice in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, it is the command of God. God said. But when it gets to Deuteronomy, he's writing the last thing. He's 40 years, he's had to transfer it to the next generation. He says all the same stuff, but it gets attributed to him. You know why? Because he was honoring who it was that taught him. And so by that, you're an educator and you have to go create a world with the words you use. Okay, I'm all done. Let's just pray real quick together, and then whoever's coming to take this to do the next thing. Lord, I ask you please to let us dispense with the foolish and shallow argument that education is or isn't important. God, it is as important as your oneness. It is as important as the revelation of monotheism. God, I ask you to give me a revelation and give it so strong that I have a mandate to teach it. I have a mandate to educate a following generation. Let me put it in my own words. Let me put it in my own context. Let us put it in our own experiences. But God, whatever you do, allow us to get this message out and to talk about it everywhere we go in the name of Jesus. God bless you. Brother Collins or whoever. Who's coming next? Okay. All right. It's a break.